In the perpetual mist that hung over the little village of East Grinstead, there stood an old house at the end of Ashmere Lane, a building barely touched by time, save for the decay that crept slowly through its damp walls and rotting timbers. The house had stood for more than a century, and in all that time few had ventured beyond its quiet grounds. It was Eleanor Mayfield, a young woman from London, who had inherited the house from a distant aunt she had barely known. The inheritance had come so suddenly and unexpectedly, sent by letter from a solicitor with the curious opening line, "This property is not for sale. It is to be lived in only, or left as is." Eleanor, a writer with a secret passion for silence and solitude, decided to stay there for the autumn, hoping that the country air and the silence of the old house would inspire the manuscript of a novel she had long postponed. But as soon as she stepped onto the threshold of the Ashmere Lane house, she felt that the place was more than just empty. It felt as if it were waiting for something. The large, empty rooms were filled with dusty old furniture and family portraits, whose gazes seemed to follow her from behind their frames. But more than that, there was one part of the house that kept drawing her attention. Whether out of curiosity or some subtle compulsion she couldn't quite understand. An old wooden door in the ceiling of the second-floor hallway, which looked like an access to the attic. She found that all the house keys were neatly stored in a desk drawer in the study, except for one. The attic key was missing, and on her first night as the wind rustled the leaves from the old maple tree outside her window, Eleanor heard a faint sound like soft footsteps and the creak of old hinges just above her head. From behind the attic door that, as the estate document stated, was never to be opened. The days at Ashmere Lane passed in almost holy silence. Eleanor wrote little, read more, and spent most of her time exploring the dark rooms and old closets of the house, touching old fabrics, leafing through yellowed, crumbling letters, piecing together pieces of a past she had never experienced. But the sounds returned every night. Footsteps, slow and steady, the creak of the floorboards, then silence. Sometimes a scraping sound, as if something were moving on the ceiling. She tried to convince herself that mice or the nighttime temperature were to blame, but the more she denied it, the stronger the feeling that someone, or something, was waiting in the attic. On the fourth night, Eleanor decided to investigate. She went up to the second floor carrying a flashlight and stood just below the attic door. There she stared at the old wooden crossbar and rusty hinges. They seemed unmoving, but they emanated a musty odor that was not from the rest of the house. She stood there in silence, her heart pounding, and then said softly, "Whoever you are, I am not afraid." At that moment, the flashlight in her hand flickered, and a cold wind blew through the closed windows. She stepped back, but as she turned to go downstairs, something caught her eye on the hallway wall. An old painting she had not seen before. A woman stood in a garden, dressed in an Edwardian dress with a blank expression and eyes that seemed to recognize Eleanor. The days that followed became increasingly unbearable. Eleanor began to dream. She woke up soaked in sweat with faint fingerprints on the glass of her bedroom window. In one dream she stood in the attic, surrounded by shadowy figures whispering in a language she did not understand. They called her name, repeating the same sentence. She broke the vow. She went back to her aunt's notes and found pages from her torn journal. all of them ending with a single sentence that made her skin crawl. No one should open the attic, not because of what was in it, but because of what would come out. The fear was no longer just the sound or the shadow. Eleanor felt her own presence awakening something. He realized that the house was not just waiting, but watching, and perhaps preparing revenge. On the 14th night, the rain came down like a whip on the roof, and the wind howled like a lost animal. Eleanor did not turn on the lights. The house had become too quiet for light, too honest in the darkness. Something changed that night. The footsteps upstairs were no longer distant. They came closer, as if they were walking around a certain spot in the attic. Every now and then there was a knock, 3 times, and then silence. When Eleanor stood under the attic door and looked up, she noticed something that made her blood stop. The door was now clean, no longer rusty on its hinges. She ran to the study, dug through the inheritance papers, and finally found a brown envelope hidden in the frame behind the portrait of the woman in the hall upstairs. Inside, an old iron key and a faded handwritten note. The writing read, "If you find this, you are too close, and the door will open by itself. Don't go up, Eleanor. Don't do as I did." Signed, Agatha Mayfield, her aunt. But it was too late. A thud echoed from above. Eleanor climbed slowly to the 2nd floor. The attic door now gaped ajar. From it came a damp, putrid smell, like the earth of an excavated grave. Key in hand, she stepped up, the narrow steps groaning beneath her feet. Each breath grew heavier, each second akin to crossing a boundary not entirely human. The attic was dark, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw that it was not just an empty room. The wooden floor formed a strange, circular pattern, like an altar or an ancient symbol. In the center of the room stood a tall mirror, cracked but intact, reflecting her own image, but not her true self. In the reflection, Eleanor looked paler, her eyes deeper, and behind her stood a woman in an Edwardian dress. The same woman from the painting in the hallway. The woman did not move, just stared at Eleanor in the mirror. Then, slowly she raised her hand, and Eleanor felt cold fingers touch her shoulder from the real world. Everything became blurry. The mirror shook, the walls rumbled. Eleanor heard a scream, not from her throat, but from within herself, as if a part of herself that had been hidden was being pulled out and replaced. Then, silence. When morning came, the villagers who passed by Ashmere Lane noticed something strange. The blinds of the old house were now open. A woman stood in the upstairs window, staring out with unblinking eyes. But it wasn't Eleanor, or not the Eleanor they knew. Days passed without word of Eleanor Mayfield. Letters from her editor went unanswered, and calls from relatives met with only a blank slate. When an investigator was finally sent by the law firm that was handling her estate, he found the house almost unchanged, unlocked, uncluttered, just quiet. Too quiet. Everything Eleanor owned was neatly arranged. Her suitcase, the notebook open on the table, even the unwashed teacup in the kitchen. There was no sign of violence, no indication that she had left voluntarily. The strangest thing was one thing. An old mirror that now stood in the middle of the living room, with fine cracks forming a vein-like pattern in the glass. The investigator stared into the mirror, and for a moment he felt not quite himself again in the reflection, as if there was a trace of someone else behind his eyes. He looked away quickly and noted in his report that the house showed no signs of lawlessness, but left a deep sense of unease. The house was eventually abandoned again, as it had always been. But rumors began to circulate in the village, about shadows seen in the upper windows at night, about footsteps on the ceiling, and about a young woman who was sometimes seen standing under an old maple tree, staring out at the lonely street that brought visitors but never sent them home. And though a warning sign had been posted on the door, painted in faded red, "Do not enter," occasionally someone would try to get in, either out of courage or curiosity. Those who returned rarely told, and those who didn't only added another to the house's long list of unanswered questions, because since that night the attic door has never closed again. The story may be over, but the shadows still linger. If your heart's still beating and your mind hasn't slipped into the darkness, prove you're one of us. Subscribe to Feed the Darkness, like if the terror thrilled you, and comment below, so the voices know you're listening. They're always watching, always waiting, until we meet again in the next nightmare.